At 0547 hours on the morning of March 8, 1968, Corporal Ethan Hale lay prone behind a wall of shredded sandbags on Hill 861A, overlooking the fog-choked valleys of Key Sand. He was staring into a scope that had gone completely pitch black. Hale was 24 years old, a Texas rancher who grew up culling coyotes, but in the eyes of the Marine Corps he was an amateur. For 6 weeks his platoon had mocked his Sears Catalog Special, a personally owned Remington 700 topped with a $47 Tasco optic he'd mail-ordered from a hunting magazine. The other scout snipers carried $800 military-issue Redfield packages. They called Hale's gear Walmart trash. But the elite North Vietnamese snipers didn't care about price tags. They had already claimed the lives of 23 Marines in 20 days, paralyzing the base. Now, with the enemy closing in and his junk scope failing at the worst possible moment, Hale had to prove that a man who knows his rifle is more dangerous than a man with a big budget. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. By the time the sun began to burn through the mist on March 8th, the siege of Key Sand had been raging for nearly 2 months. Over 20,000 North Vietnamese Army, NVA, troops had surrounded 6,000 Marines. It wasn't just the 152mm artillery that was killing men, it was the ghosts in the tree-line. Hale had arrived in February with a rifle the armorers refused to service. While the scout sniper platoon used the M40, the military's tactical version of the Remington 700, Hale used the civilian 700 BDL. He had spent 2 years of ranch wages to customize it, but the humid jungle and the relentless concussions from NVA incoming had shattered the internal prisms of his budget Tasco scope. On February 26th, 4 Marines were killed in a single morning. The NVA snipers were using Type 53 Mosin Nagants with Soviet PU scopes, and they were winning. That night, Captain Wolf summoned Hale. The base was pinned down, morale was flatlining, and the official snipers were struggling to locate the muzzle flashes. Wolf looked at the battered, mail-order rifle and asked one question. Can that catalog piece of shit actually hit anything, or is it just for show? Hale didn't give him a sales pitch. He told him about the 600-yard groups he'd shot in Texas and the hybrid technique he'd been practicing in secret, using his iron sights for the close work and timing his scope usage for the brief seconds it cleared between artillery rounds. Hale didn't have a spotter or a high-tech laser rangefinder. He had a canteen, a pocket full of .308 Winchester rounds, and a junk rifle. At 0623 hours, he spotted a flicker of movement in a tree-line 420 yards out. His scope was intermittent. The internal coating was peeling due to heat and vibration, creating a blackout effect. He waited. He breathed. For 3 minutes the image was dark. Then, as the North Vietnamese sniper adjusted his position in a spider hole, the light hit Hale's lens just right. The image cleared for a split second. Hale didn't hesitate. The Remington's trigger, which he'd polished to a 3.5-pound break, snapped. The .308 round traveled the distance in less than half a second. Through the failing optic, Hale saw the NVA sniper slump forward. It was his first confirmed kill, but it wouldn't be his last. By the time the siege was lifted, the Marines who had laughed at his Walmart trash would be lining up to have him teach them how to shoot when the world goes dark. Ethan Hale didn't learn to shoot from a Marine Corps drill instructor. He learned from the shifting winds of West Texas. By age 12, he was culling coyotes on his father's ranch at 400 yards with a bolt action he'd treated better than his own skin. By 18, he was a regional competitive champion, possessing a preternatural ability to read the mirage rising off the desert floor. When he enlisted in 1966, he didn't just bring his grit, he brought his own steel. Before shipping out, Hale purchased a Remington 700 BDL chambered in .308 and mounted a Tasco 3-9X variable power scope he'd found in a herder's mail-order catalog for $47. To the brass, it was an unauthorized civilian toy. To Hale, it was an extension of his own steady hand. The military 700s are fine, he'd tell anyone who asked, but I know exactly where this rifle breathes. When Hale arrived at the Key Sand Combat Base in February 1968, the world was already on fire. The siege of Key Sand had begun on January 21st, pitting 6,000 Marines against over 20,000 North Vietnamese regulars. The air was thick with the scent of cordite and damp red clay. Hale, assigned to a regular infantry MOS, immediately drew the attention of the elite scout sniper platoon. They stood over their military-issue M40 rifles, beasts topped with $800 Redfield AccuRange scopes, and looked at Hale's checkered walnut stock with open derision. "What is that, a deer rifle, Hale?" one sergeant barked, his voice carrying over the thump of distant mortars. "You order that from a Sears catalog? That scope looks like it came out of a Cracker Jack box." Despite outshooting half the platoon during informal qualifications, Hale wasn't invited to join their ranks. He was just a grunt with a hunting gun. The mockery, however, died a quick death as the tactical reality of the siege set in. The NVA strategy was a suffocating blend of heavy artillery and sniper terror. Between February 19th and the 26th, NVA marksmen hidden in the elephant grass and jagged ridgelines killed 8 Marines and wounded 14 others. The base was paralyzed. Men were afraid to even fill canteens at the creek. The breaking point came on February 26th, when 4 Marines were dropped in a single afternoon by a sniper no one could locate. The professional optics were struggling with the shifting fog and deep shadows of the treeline. That evening, amidst the smoke of burning refuse and the scream of incoming 152mm shells, Captain Wolf found Hale cleaning his Remington in a muddy trench. The captain looked at the $47 Tasco scope, then at the mounting casualties on his morning report. There was no more time for the politics of equipment. "Hale," Wolf said, his voice low and gravelly, "the scouts can't find this ghost. They tell me your gear is junk, but I've seen your record from Texas. Can that catalog gun actually shoot, or is it just for show?" Hale looked up, his thumb tracing the smooth bolt handle of the 700. He knew he could make the shot, but he didn't yet know that his junk scope was about to suffer a catastrophic failure at the exact moment a North Vietnamese trigger was pulled. At dawn on February 27th, the mist clung to the ravines of Hill 861A like a wet shroud. Ethan Hale sat motionless in a sandbagged bunker, the walnut stock of his Remington 700 pressed against his cheek. At 0623 hours, a single crack echoed from the treeline 420 yards out. A Marine on the perimeter crumpled. While others scrambled for cover, Hale tracked the faint dissipation of blue-gray smoke. Through the Tasco's lens, the world was sharp and clear. He adjusted his dial, found the dark silhouette of an NVA sniper repositioning in the fork of a tree, and slowed his heart rate. He squeezed the trigger, a clean 3-pound break. The rifle recoiled, and the enemy marksman plummeted through the branches. The Marines in the trench, who had spent weeks calling his rifle a toy, watched in stunned silence as Hale worked the bolt with mechanical precision. By the following day, Hale had been moved to a permanent counter-sniper position. He worked the ridges with a rancher's patience, claiming a second kill at 380 yards and a third at 290. The mockery had vanished, replaced by a growing respect for the man with the catalog special. But at 1,400 hours on February 28th, the earth began to scream. The NVA opened up with a massive artillery barrage, raining 152mm shells across the base. Hale hunkered down as the ground buckled and the air itself seemed to shatter from the concussions. When the fire finally lifted, he raised his rifle to glass the perimeter. Panic flared in his chest. He looked through the scope and saw nothing but an absolute, impenetrable black. He pulled back, checking the lenses for mud or cracks, but they were pristine. He looked again. Total darkness. 5 minutes of frantic waiting passed before a dim, murky image finally flickered back into view. The concussions had done what the NVA snipers couldn't. The internal prism of the budget scope had been jarred loose, beginning a slow, mechanical death. That evening, another barrage hit, and the scope blacked out for 12 agonizing minutes. A terrifying pattern was emerging. The heat of the jungle combined with the shockwaves of artillery were causing the internal components to shift and fail unpredictably. The scout snipers, hearing of his struggles, didn't offer sympathy. "Told you that catalog junk wouldn't hold up to a real war," they sneered. Hale was now trapped in a lethal game of chance. On March 1st, he managed to drop a 4th NVA sniper during a frantic 2-minute window of clarity, only for the scope to go pitch black for 2 hours straight that night. He was a hunter without eyes in a valley full of killers, yet he refused to retreat. He was beginning to realize that if he wanted to survive the elite snipers currently hunting him, he would have to learn to shoot with a rifle that was effectively blind. But as the NVA's top marksmen began to coordinate their fire, Hale discovered a way to use his broken optics that no manual in the Marine Corps had ever dared to teach. Between March 2nd and March 8th, Ethan Hale realized he was no longer fighting with a precision instrument. He was fighting with a dying one. Most snipers would have turned the rifle into the armorer, but Hale refused to quit. Instead, he spent his nights in the flickering light of a bunker oil lamp, drafting dual-range cards. One card was for his Tasco scope, when it deigned to work, and the other was for his iron sights. He began practicing a frantic, unnatural drill, transitioning from the glass to the steel sights in under a second. It was a hybrid technique, born of desperation. Under 200 yards, he would trust his eyes and the rifle's factory sights. Beyond that, he would wait for the scope's blackout to lift. The system was baptized in fire on March 3rd. An NVA sniper opened up from a tree line at 165 yards, pinning down a supply detail. Hale brought his rifle up, but the Tasco was a tube of solid ink. Without a second of hesitation, he dropped his cheek lower on the walnut stock, aligning the front post with the rear notch. Using Kentucky windage to compensate for the crossbreeze, he squeezed. The .308 round found its mark. It was the first time most Marines at Khe Sanh had ever seen a sniper kill made with iron sights. Over the next 3 days, Hale added his 6th and 7th kills, developing a sixth sense for his failing gear. He noticed a faint color shift at the edges of the blackout, a slight amber hue, that signaled the scope was about to clear. He began timing his movements to these brief windows of optical clarity. By March 7th, the irony of the situation had peaked. Hale claimed his 8th kill with irons at 185 yards, then just hours later, utilized a clear window in his scope to drop an NVA spotter at 440 yards, his longest shot of the siege. Sergeant Kowalski, the scout sniper platoon leader who had once led the mockery, finally walked into Hale's sandbag nest. He watched Hale switch between systems with the fluid grace of a man playing a piano. "How the hell are you doing this?" Kowalski asked, his voice devoid of its former bite. Hale explained the hybrid system, to which Kowalski simply shook his head. "That shouldn't work." Hale adjusted his cap and replied, "But it does." However, the NVA was not a static enemy, they were students of the kill. By March 8th, sniper activity in Hale's sector plummeted, but casualties spiked in adjacent zones. The enemy was avoiding him, becoming ghosts once more. On March 9th, the trap finally snapped. Hale spotted a dark shape at 350 yards. His scope was functioning and the target appeared perfect. He took the shot, but as the figure slumped, he realized the movement was wrong. It was a decoy, a uniform stuffed with dry grass. 80 yards to the left, the Real NVA sniper fired at Hale's muzzle flash. The enemy bullet slammed into a sandbag 4 inches from Hale's ear, spraying grit into his eyes. As Hale rolled left to find cover, the jarring concussion of his own rifle triggered a total scope blackout. He was pinned down, blind, and trapped for 20 agonizing minutes while the NVA marksman searched for his head. He eventually extracted under a haze of smoke, the adrenaline still coursing through him like battery acid. The hunter had become the hunted, and as he wiped the red clay from his face, he realized the NVA hadn't just studied his position, they had discovered his secret. The enemy now knew Hale was blind half the time, and they were preparing a 3-man elite team specifically designed to exploit the one flaw in his mail-order rifle that he couldn't fix with grit alone. By March 10th, Ethan Hale understood that the NVA was no longer just shooting at Marines. They were specifically hunting the man with the junk rifle. Realizing he couldn't survive another near miss while blinded by his failing optics, Hale requested a spotter. He was paired with LCPL, Marcus Webb, a farm kid from Arkansas with eyes like a hawk and a steady temperament. Webb carried a standard-issue M16 and a pair of 7x50 Marine binoculars. Together, they developed a system that shouldn't have worked. When Hale's Tasco scope went black, Webb would glass the target and talk Hale onto the mark using iron sights. The system faced its first true test on March 11th. At 310 yards, a North Vietnamese marksman was harassing a patrol from a dead tree line. Hale peered into his scope and saw only a wall of ink. "Scope's out," Hale whispered. Webb didn't blink. 11 o'clock, base of the dead tree, 310 yards. Wind is left to right, 5 miles per hour. Hale adjusted his rifle, aligning his iron sights based on Webb's voice. He squeezed. The .308 round covered the distance, and the NVA shooter dropped. Webb lowered his binos in disbelief. "That's the damnedest thing I ever saw," he muttered. Over the next 3 days, they claimed 4 more kills, numbers 11 through 14, using a frantic mix of fleeting scope shots and iron sight corrections. Despite their success, the air at Khe Sanh grew heavier. While Hale's sector was quiet, the rest of the base was being bled white. Total Marine casualties from snipers had climbed to 23. On March 15th, Hale and Webb moved to a jagged position on Hill 881S. Through a rare window of scope clarity, Hale spotted a high-value target at 520 yards and took him down, his 15th kill. But the victory was short-lived. Seconds after the shot, the NVA responded with a vicious mortar counterattack. A fragmenting round impacted the ridge, and Webb was peppered with shrapnel, sustaining severe leg wounds. As the medevac chopper lifted Webb toward Da Nang, Hale was left standing alone in the red dust, his only ally gone. The following morning, Captain Wolf summoned Hale to a command bunker lit only by a single lantern. Intelligence had confirmed that 3 elite NVA snipers were still operating, having survived 3 weeks of intense counter-sniper operations. They were the ones responsible for the 23 dead Marines. "These last few are the best," Wolf warned, his face a mask of exhaustion. "They know you're out there. They know your rifle is failing. They've been watching you." Hale spent March 17 studying the pattern of the remaining kills. He realized he wasn't facing individuals anymore. He was facing a coordinated cell. One worked at extreme long range, beyond 800 yards, while another stayed close to bait the Marines into dead ground. The third was a commander, a ghost who directed the other 2. As Hale cleaned the grit from his malfunctioning Tasco, he realized the NVA hadn't just studied his habits. They had lured him into a specific sector of the jungle where his 400-yard rancher skills would be useless against a shot he never saw coming. On March 18, the war at Khe Sanh shifted from a brawl into a surgical nightmare. At 0730 hours, a Marine was struck down by a single shot so distant the report was muffled by the humid air. Intelligence estimated the distance at over 850 yards, well beyond the effective reliable range of Hale's civilian Remington and certainly beyond what a $47 Tasco was ever designed to resolve. To make matters worse, the internal damage to Hale's optic had reached a terminal phase. The glass was now functioning only 30% of the time, flickering in and out like a dying light bulb. Hale spent the next 48 hours playing a grueling game of psychological endurance. He positioned himself on a rocky outcropping with a panoramic view of the suspected NVA hide sites, but the jungle refused to give up its secrets. On March 18, he sat motionless for 6 hours, but the scope remained a tube of black ink during every critical movement in the treeline. On the 19th, he waited 7 hours in the sweltering heat. The scope cleared for a tantalizing 90 seconds, but the valley stayed still. He was a hunter waiting for 2 variables to align, a target to appear and his equipment to miraculously cooperate. The alignment finally came at 0615 hours on March 20th. The morning mist parted, and as Hale peered through the lens, the image snapped into a sharp, albeit dim, focus. 780 yards away, a North Vietnamese sniper was repositioning amongst a cluster of jagged rocks. Hale knew he had less than a minute before the next vibration or heat spike killed his view. He calculated the 12-mile-per-hour quartering wind, adjusted his elevation dial with a steady click, and held his breath. He fired. The heavy .308 round traveled the distance in a long looping arc, and through the glass, Hale saw the silhouette drop. 20 seconds later, the scope went pitch black. The victory was immediate, but the cost was tactical exposure. The long-range kill had revealed Hale's general position to the rest of the NVA trio. At 0847 hours, the second member of the elite team, the close-range specialist, closed the gap. A bullet cracked just 6 inches from Hale's head, shattering a rock into lethal spray. The shot had come from only 140 yards away, an area Hale had cleared just minutes prior. With his scope currently blacked out, Hale didn't panic. He dropped to his iron sights, scanning the dense undergrowth with the naked eye. He spotted a shadow displacing through the ferns at 160 yards. Leading the movement, he fired with the irons. The second sniper fell, silenced forever. By the end of the day, 2 of the 3 elite hunters were dead, but the most dangerous remained, the commander. On March 21st, the jungle went deathly silent. No shots were fired and no Marines were targeted. The final NVA sniper had gone to ground, disappearing into the vast, emerald labyrinth of the Vietnamese highlands. He wasn't running. He was waiting for the shadows to grow long, knowing that Hale's failing equipment was about to face its final absolute collapse. At 0400 hours on March 22nd, Ethan Hale slipped into the darkness alone. Intelligence placed the final NVA commander on a jagged ridge northwest of Hill 861, a position that commanded the high ground and the respect of every Marine in the valley. Hale moved with the silence of a coyote, settling into a concealed hide before the first gray light touched the canopy. He was a man fighting 2 enemies, a master marksman and a failing machine. Between 0530 and noon, the jungle offered nothing but the oppressive heat and the buzzing of insects. His Tasco scope died at 0600, plunging his world into blackness for nearly 4 hours. It flickered to life at 0945 for a tantalizing 30 minutes before the internal prism shifted again at 1015, leaving him effectively blind. The stalemate shattered at 1215 hours. A Marine patrol moving through the draw below took fire. One man killed instantly. The shot had come from the very ridge Hale was glassing, but because of the scope's blackout, he had seen no muzzle flash and no movement. It was a professional kill, timed perfectly to Hale's mechanical vulnerability. When the optic finally cleared at 1400, Hale began a systematic, agonizing search of every shadow. 520 yards out, in an elevated rock crevice, he found it, an unnatural shadow and the slight disturbance of vegetation that didn't match the surrounding flora. Hale watched the spot for 45 minutes, his finger resting lightly on the trigger guard. At 1445 he saw a slight movement, the slow, deliberate shift of a shoulder. He brought the crosshairs onto the center of the shadow and began the slow exhale of a shooter's breath. But as his finger began the final press, the image vanished. The scope went pitch black. No, not now. Not fucking now, he hissed through clenched teeth that he transitioned to his iron sights, but at 520 yards, the front post was wider than the entire rock crevice. He was forced to wait. 15 minutes later, still blinded by the optic, he watched with his naked eye as a dark figure displaced, moving with predatory speed to a new position. By the time the scope cleared at 1518, the target was a ghost. The afternoon dissolved into a grueling game of cat and mouse. Hale repositioned 3 times, but the scope was a fickle ally, blacking out for 10 minutes and clearing for 5. At 1830, another Marine was wounded by a shot from a completely different direction. The NVA commander wasn't just hiding. He was hunting Hale's likely positions, circling him like a shark in deep water. As 2,000 hours brought the absolute darkness of the Vietnamese night, Hale was forced to extract to friendly lines. He spent the night cleaning his Remington 700 and checking the mounts, knowing that his equipment was on the verge of total collapse. As the sun began to rise on March 23rd, Hale realized the scope hadn't just blacked out, it was starting to rattle. The final duel was about to reach a breaking point where the only thing left between a Marine and a Soviet-made bullet would be a piece of glass that had finally, irrevocably shattered. At 0330 hours on March 23rd, Ethan Hale moved out under a moonless sky, choosing a route that defied every standard sniper protocol. Instead of returning to the ridges, he crept into a shallow, abandoned NVA fighting hole. A risky, claustrophobic position that put him in the enemy's backyard but offered a line of sight the commander wouldn't expect. As the sun began its ascent at 0500, Hale's world once again turned to ink. The Tasco scope suffered its longest continuous blackout yet. For 4 agonizing hours, the glass remained a dead, black void. Hale lay in the red mud, watching with the naked eye as the jungle breathed, knowing that while he sat blind, another Marine might be in a crosshair. He considered aborting, but the weight of the 23 men already lost held him to the earth. At 0915, the darkness inside the optic began to fray. The image was fuzzy at first, like looking through a rain-streaked window, but by 0923 the internal prism settled. The scope was fully functional. Hale didn't waste a second, beginning a frantic, systematic search of the rock outcroppings 500 yards out. At 0940 he found him. The NVA commander was perched 480 yards away, expertly concealed in a jagged crevice. Through the glass, Hale could see the enemy sniper was focused intently on the ridge Hale had occupied just 24 hours earlier. The hunter had the advantage. The target was looking the wrong way. Hale worked the math in his head. 480 yards. An 8-mile-per-hour wind pushing right to left. He clicked his elevation dial, stabilized his breathing, and settled the crosshairs on the dark silhouette. But as his finger touched the trigger, the image flickered. The edges of the lens began to darken, the telltale sign of an imminent blackout. "No," he whispered, "stay clear. Just 30 more seconds." He knew he had less than 10 seconds of vision left. He reached a snap decision. Take an imperfect shot now or risk the scope dying for the day. He squeezed. The Remington 700 recoiled, and the .308 round shrieked across the valley. Through the fading, wavering image, Hale watched the NVA sniper jerk back and drop. 2 seconds later, the scope went pitch black for the final time. Hale waited 30 minutes in the silence, his scope useless, before moving forward to confirm. He found the enemy marksman slumped over a Type 53 Mosin Nagant, a Soviet-designed veteran of many kills. Based on the 60 spent casings nearby, this man alone had likely claimed over half the 23 Marines lost to the shadows. By 1100 hours, Hale was back at friendly lines, placing the enemy's PU scope on Captain Wolf's desk. "That's all of them?" Wolf asked, his eyes moving from the trophy to the battered, mail-order rifle in Hale's hands. "All we know about," Hale replied. For the rest of the month, the sniper fire in the Khe sector ceased. The threat was neutralized, not by the most expensive gear in the Marine Corps arsenal, but by a $47 catalog optic and a man who refused to be blind. But as the siege lifted, Hale's victory felt hollow. He had stopped the killing, but he couldn't stop the questions from the brass. The Marine Corps Equipment Board was about to take a very close look at Hale's shattered scope, leading to a revelation that would change the way every American sniper was trained for the next 50 years. On March 24, 1968, the official tally was finalized. Corporal Ethan Hale had eliminated 15 elite NVA snipers in just 28 days. Intelligence officers estimated his work had prevented at least 30 additional Marine casualties, yet as Hale sat through the debriefing, he felt no sense of triumph. The number that burned in his mind wasn't 15, it was 23. 23 Marines had been zipped into body bags before he could stop the bleeding. In the quiet of the bunker, the internal reckoning was brutal. He couldn't stop wondering if those men would be alive if he had been faster, or if he hadn't wasted those precious minutes waiting for a $47 piece of glass to clear. Captain Wolf, seeing the hollow look in Hale's eyes, leaned over the map table. "You did what nobody else in this valley could," Wolf said firmly. "Scope or no scope, you saved this base." The legend of the hybrid sniper spread quickly. On March 25, Sergeant Kowalski and the Scout Sniper Platoon, the same men who had once mocked Hale's deer rifle, approached him with a request that would change Marine Corps history. They didn't want to laugh, they wanted to learn. Over the next 10 days, Hale conducted improvised training sessions under the constant threat of incoming fire. He taught them how to create dual-range cards and how to transition instantly to backup iron sights when an optic failed. His mantra was simple but revolutionary: the scope fails, the mission doesn't. Adapt. The war, however, wasn't finished with Ethan Hale. On April 1st, during a training exercise near the perimeter, a massive 152mm artillery round impacted nearby. Shrapnel tore through the air, catching Hale in the left shoulder and back. He was medevaced to Da Nang, his chest tight not from the pain, but from the fear of leaving his rifle behind. When he finally returned to Khe Sanh for limited duty on April 8th, he found his Remington 700 waiting for him. A base armorer had finally dissected the Tasco scope and emerged shaking his head. The internal prism was shattered into jagged shards, and the mirror coating had degraded into a milky film. "I'm amazed this thing worked at all after that first concussion," the armorer remarked. Hale just ran a thumb over the battered tube. "It worked when it had to," he replied. "Most of the time." In May 1968, Hale sat down to write a detailed after-action report. He didn't write about glory, he wrote about failure. He documented the technical limitations of budget optics and outlined the necessity for backup sighting systems and rigorous durability testing. His report reached the Marine Corps Equipment Board, planting the seeds for what would eventually become standard military doctrine. When the siege of Khe Sanh was officially lifted on July 9th, and Hale rotated back to the States in August, he carried the broken Tasco and the Remington 700 with him as souvenirs of a desperate summer. He thought he was leaving the war behind in the red clay of Vietnam, but as he settled back into civilian life, Hale began to realize that the lessons he learned from a broken scope were about to follow him into a new kind of battlefield in the American Southwest. In August 1968, Ethan Hale stood on the tarmac in Texas, an honorable discharge in his pocket and a heavy silence in his soul. Like many who returned from the highlands of Vietnam, he found the quiet of civilian life deafening. The ghosts of the 23 Marines lost at Khe Sanh followed him home, and the catalog special rifle sat in its case, a reminder of a victory that felt incomplete. Seeking a way to channel his skills into service, Hale joined the Phoenix Police Department in 1969. By 1972, he was selected for the newly formed SWAT team. While other officers focused on the latest high-tech gear of the 70s, Hale obsessed over something else: what happens when that gear fails. In 1974, Hale codified his experiences into the first formal Phoenix PD sniper doctrine. He emphasized a radical concept of redundancy. Every rifle required a primary optic, a secondary backup optic, and most importantly, functional iron sights. He forced his trainees to run drills where he would physically block their scopes, demanding they hit targets using only the steel sights. "Hope for the best," he would tell them, his voice echoing through the Arizona canyons, "but train for when everything breaks." This hybrid doctrine wasn't just theory. Throughout the 80s and 90s, multiple Phoenix SWAT incidents saw officers successfully neutralize threats after their primary optics were damaged during entries. Credits that Hale's protocols were directly responsible for saving lives. Hale's influence eventually circled back to the Corps. In 1982, the U.S. Marine Corps formally adopted backup sighting requirements for all Scout sniper rifles, specifically citing the hard-won lessons from the siege of Khe Sanh in their doctrinal justification. By the 1990s, Hale was consulting for major military optics manufacturers. He developed stress testing protocols that simulated the exact artillery concussions that had shattered his $47 Tasco. His benchmark for every new piece of glass was simple: if it can't survive Khe Sanh, it can't go to war. Following the events of 9/11, his methods proved vital once again in the rugged mountains of Afghanistan and the urban mazes of Iraq, where Marine snipers used his iron sight techniques to stay in the fight after their advanced optics were battered by IED blasts. Ethan Hale passed away in 2015 at the age of 71. His funeral in Phoenix was a rare gathering of two worlds: grit-faced Marine Scout snipers and tactical police officers, joined by the very engineers who now built the world's most durable combat optics. The eulogies didn't focus on the 15 kills. They focused on his refusal to quit when the tools in his hands were broken. Today, his Remington 700 remains with his family, still wearing the original battered Tasco scope. The scope is housed in a modest display case, its internal prism still shattered and its coatings milky with age. It is a piece of equipment that, by every law of physics and engineering, should have been useless. Yet, it sits there as a testament to the fact that the man behind the trigger is always more important than the glass on top of it. A small brass plaque at the base of the display carries the final lesson Ethan Hale left for the next generation of hunters: sometimes good enough is perfect. History is written by the victors, but it's remembered by people like you. Every time you scroll past a story like this without engaging, a piece of our veteran heritage slips further into the fog. We spent hours researching the exact equipment and dates of Hale's stand so you wouldn't forget him. Do your part to keep these records alive. Like the video and subscribe so we can keep digging these stories out of the archives. If you've ever had to fix something broken to save someone else, tell your story in the comments. Don't let Hale's legacy end here.